I've been following the news lately, and I have to say, watching the whole US-China tariff war has had me sweating in front of the screen every night. It seems like with every passing day, there's just more and more bad news to the detriment of both countries. So I've been thinking about my friends and family back in China, as well as reflecting on my childhood that I spent in Shanghai. I was reminded specifically of certain cultural values that were deeply instilled in me from the time that I spent in Shanghai. Teachings from my family, my school, and also the community at large. I realized that some of these cultural concepts and values that were highly praised and encouraged in China are way less emphasized or sometimes not even present in Western societies. Sometimes there isn't even a word in the English language to describe ideas that are very clear and familiar in almost all East Asian languages. So that's what I wanted to discuss today. Because I'm someone very interested in comparative language and culture, I wanted to explore some deep-rooted values in Chinese or East Asian societies that are not as emphasized in American cultures. Of course, I'm not a professional historian or sociologist, and I know that I cannot generalize any characteristics of large, diverse populations, but I simply find it interesting to muse over some of these differences in traditional culture and teaching. I think it's also important to consider some of the implications these characteristics may have in the business world or in our political economic affairs. So there are a lot of cultural differences that you've probably already heard of. Things like how East Asian societies emphasize the importance of collective culture or filial piety, or the belief in traditional education. So today I'm going to skip over those and talk about some other ideas that have been less discussed. First, yielding and enduring. The Chinese word 让 means to yield, to concede, to give in. The Chinese word 忍 means to bear, to endure, to refrain from doing something impulsive. It's important to note that these are not only very commonly used verbs in the Chinese language, but they're also verbs with highly positive connotations. 让, or to yield, is mostly used in social interactions, and ever since a very young age, children are taught to always yield to or concede to other children. Adults would commonly say things like 让着点其他小伙伴, to teach children the importance of conceding, yielding, in order to show a selfless character. 忍, to endure, is often used in the context of work, studies, or difficult long-term projects. Eastern philosophies tend to remind us that life is filled with suffering, and thus enduring through suffering is a basic skill that everyone needs to have. There's a common proverb that everyone knows, which goes like 小不忍则乱大谋. So with that, you can see a little bit of how our culture perceives things like social interaction and strategy planning. Second, humility and limitation. The word 谦逊 means humility, modesty, self-effacing. The word 节约 means frugality or saving money, but each character themselves also have ancient meanings of self-regulation, self-limitation, and self-moderation. So these words and concepts also exist in the Western culture, but it seems like they are less emphasized and they're seen as less praiseworthy as compared to the Chinese culture. These concepts also seem to be more associated with traditional and conservative religious teachings in the West, whereas in China, they are very modern and everyday concepts. So for example, in China, it is still considered quite rude and pretentious to accept high compliments that other people pay you. And it's pretty much unacceptable to talk about one's own qualities openly. Doing so would be considered super proud or egocentric, but usually people would just respond by denying the compliments or returning some other compliments back to the person. Now, of course, I don't necessarily think that these are good practices. In fact, sometimes I think it can be a little bit fake and excessive, but the point is just that in East Asian cultures, people place high importance in showing a very humble front and suppressing one's own image or ego. Next, let's talk about alliance and coordination. The word 缘分 means fate or destiny that brings people together. The word 默契 means tacit understanding, mutual understanding, or good coordination. When it comes to building relationships, both professional and personal, Chinese people tend to place high importance on the role of very abstract ideas like fate or destiny. Rather than emphasizing on human efforts or strategies like better communication, people tend to believe that it's the right fate that brings people together. You might have seen the Korean movie Past Lives, which really goes in to discuss the theme of yin and in Korean, which roughly translates to fate and is about the same word in Chinese. So it's very common for people to talk about the role of 缘分 or 默契 when it comes to the success or failure of any relationship. People will say things like 我们俩合作很愉快，很有默契 or things like 缘分未到，不要强求 It sounds almost superstitious, but people really do believe that relationships cannot be forced by human efforts and is mostly dependent on these superhuman forces. Finally, let's talk about contained and concealed. The words 含蓄, 内敛 means contained, veiled, introverted. The word 隐 means hidden, concealed, difficult to read. While in Western culture, characteristics of extroversion, ability to show and communicate is highly praised, it's almost the opposite in East Asian culture. Someone who is too friendly, too charismatic is sometimes seen as naive, ignorant, conceited, or even deceiving. The whole idea of showcasing oneself is almost considered a weakness. On the other hand, quiet and more reserved people are very often seen as intelligent, capable, and trustworthy. The word 内敛 describes introverts who have a lot of internal knowledge, experience, and capacity, but who disdains from showcasing these skills. The Art of War by Sun Tzu reminds us on multiple occasions to hide our skills like treasures. It says that the tree that stands taller than the other trees around it will be the first to be destroyed by the wind. Thus, the word yin, to conceal or to hide, is not only a warring strategy, but is almost a skill that's adopted by people in their daily lives. This is why when you look at Chinese businessmen or politicians speaking in public, they all seem to hold the same poker face throughout their speech. While Chinese people also like charismatic leaders, they're simply more trusting of leaders who are capable of hiding their feelings. Being hard to read is a positive sign of caution and trustworthiness. So these are just some of the cultural differences that I've noticed, but I'm sure there are also a lot of other cultural differences out there. Again, the point is not to make any generalizations, as I know there is just so much diversity within even the Chinese population or the American population. I'm also not making any type of judgments over any of these values. In the end, I want to remind us that no matter how different our cultures are, we share way more similarities than differences. And whenever there are any international conflicts of any kind, it's so important to remember that it's the few politicians who act, but the millions of people on both sides who suffer. So with that, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you have a peaceful rest of the day. Bye.